One of your required pieces of evidence in the assessment module is an assessment of a recognition of prior learning. So RPL, or recognition of prior learning, is where in the vet sector we try and encourage people that have had workplace experience to try and gain some nationally recognised certification. So not everybody has to attend training. Many times they can be providing evidence of what they currently do or have recently done in a work situation, and that certification is a fantastic function for them, because when it's on their resume, in this modern world, you tend to send off a resume for a job, and it's not a human being that'll do the first cull, it's a computer system. So it will cull by the qualification. So that way we're getting some nationally recognised standards through this certification and qualification process. So in a recognised prior learning scenario, there are different steps, and this becomes a bit of a flow chart depending on what's available for the assessor. So step one is the applicant contacts the RTO, says that they want to apply for recognised prior learning. So then there would be an application form. And what I've done for you here is just given you, let me just go back up to the top here, just some extracts. There's many different RPL kits depending on the course you're training and assessing in, but your RTO will have whatever recognised prior learning documentation or kit, same thing, available for you. So what I've tried to do is just give you a brief summary of the areas of documentation that your candidate would receive. So usually you would have to give them some form of information about how they should be preparing for recognition. So here's just a written example of that, and I will actually attach that for your perusal and future use. You then want to give them these steps that we're going through, and then you're asking them you're helping guide them in that RPL process. So any form of documentation that can give them a list of evidence that they could start to gather. So it tends to be in a pro forma way, in a form that you can give them. So here's an example of this is something that's been designed for the Certificate 4 in Training and Assessing for fast tracking teachers. So this actually explicitly states a current teacher registration. So all of these words in bold print would be quite relevant for teachers. So the ones that are highlighted are what we would consider very strong evidence that we would want them and guide them to be providing. But you can see there's all sorts of things here. Lesson plans, samples of criterion-based assessment. Now that isn't competency-based assessment, but that could show some level of the transferable skills, because teachers would be working with criterion-based assessment. Letters from employers, supervisors, this is your third-party style of evidence. So, as I said, there's pro formas that your RTO that you work for would be providing you with there to help guide them. This is an example of a pro forma for a third-party report. So you can allow the workplace supervisor or colleague to place in the date, mark it to the attention of the RTO or the assessor for the RTO, and regarding skills as a registered teacher or skills as a forklift operator or warehouse supervisor, whatever it is, whatever their current occupation is. And then I certify that, and then they put the candidate's name, and then whatever type of formed sentence that would be highly relevant. So that would have been built in by the RTO in the first place. And then this form has been designed to just simply ask that supervisor to initial any of these types of tasks that they see that the candidate can perform. Okay, so this isn't an exceptionally strong piece of evidence. This is an indirect one, because we're not going very deeply into each fleshed out performance criterion. Okay, so at the end of that way it keeps it nice and simple and quick. We really don't want to be taking up people's time and effort, and then, you know, it actually allows them to state their email and phone number, because we would want to contact them if we needed any further information or some sort of elaboration on what they're providing us. We want to be able to get in contact with them. And then there's room for their workplace supervisor or colleague to sign and print their name and position. So that's an example of a third-party report pro forma. There's just some more examples there. This is a more generic RPL application form. So this isn't now designed specifically for fast-tracking teachers. This is just for people in general, so it's a very general form. And because it's electronic, you're welcome to use this, and, you know, you could take out any that don't relate to your particular industry that you're training and assessing in. But look, the RTO you work for will have all of the required documentation anyway. Now, it also mentions step 3, that there's a practical demonstration of the skill set. So we can come back here. We can see that they've made an initial application. They've been preparing their documents for review, so any third-party reports, all of those little checklists there of their testimonies and qualifications or CVs or anything from that checklist that we've got. And then what happens is what's called a competency conversation, which is, I guess, what we're calling here at the interview is the competency conversation. So once the assessor has had a chance to review the documents, the third-party reports, perhaps speak to a workplace supervisor for further clarification, they're then in a position to look at any identified gaps in the knowledge, or just, you know, get some strong evidence about the candidate's knowledge portion of their competency. So they would then conduct a competency conversation, and they would at that position be really starting to look at how close to whether the candidate's competent or not. So what we have to do as part of that process again is validate all of the evidence that's been provided. So let's do a quick little bit of revision there. In our first module, we looked at some aspects of this when we were looking at our assessment planning. So we talked about evidence that was direct, indirect and supplementary, and you can see our little arrow here going from you know, a really dark bold blue, which indicates strong evidence, down to kind of like a medium level of strength, and down into, you know, the less strong style of evidence with the supplementary questions or a resume, for example. Now, don't forget, however, we do need some questions because they are a strong form of the knowledge portion of competency. So I guess when we start to review all of those documentations, like a third-party report that might have been provided, let's have a look. Well, that's an indirect, that's a sort of a medium level piece. So we couldn't just have third-party reports. Don't forget, when we validate, we look and make sure under the rules of evidence that there's a sufficient range of evidence. So, you know, some other things might be their CV. Well, if they've given us their curriculum vitae, their resume, we definitely want to be contacting the referees on that to ensure that they did actually participate in that work. But that's a very general type of statement. You know, we flesh right down to performance criterion. So I know with an RPL we certainly need to look at things more holistically than someone who has had no prior experience and needs to be assessed right down to a performance criterion level. But, you know, we do need to be mindful of that range and then the strength of the evidence as well. So this is another review slide. We had that table there in week 1, direct, indirect, supplementary. Then we looked at some of the methods, you know, the products, the knowledge, the skills, the attitude, you know, and be able to determine what these methods are as far as the strength goes there. So obviously still any observation of a performance or any observation of the product is going to be very strong evidence here. Okay, so that's why, we really would look to see at some sort of practical assessment. So can they supply us with some product that we can directly observe, or can we see a recording of them so we can directly observe them in the workplace? If that's possible, that's something that's negotiated. They may not feel comfortable, or there might be some security around that work site. There's policies where recording can't occur. So, I mean, it's all negotiated, but what we're looking for overall is a range. So obviously you could ask the questions in your competency conversation, and that's going to cover the knowledge. A third-party report would be fantastic, but you're always aiming for at least some samples of product. Okay, unless there's some form of qualification or professional registration where another industry body has been monitoring and maintaining all of these benchmarks. Okay, so that's when those types of products would be suitable. And certainly when we're fast tracking teachers, the fact if we've got a current teacher's registration, QCT, for example, for teachers registered in Queensland, we've got the professional standards, and now everything's moving to the national standards. So teachers all over Australia have to continue their professional development and, you know, have to log so many hours of professional development and prove to their superiors that they're competent still. So in certain aspects, which is the delivery aspect of that, we've been able to substitute, you know, direct observation for the fact that a professional body is maintaining that level of strong evidence of that direct observation. Okay, so certainly within your industry, you're the expert. You are going to validate with other RTOs. Your RTO is going to guide you on what's acceptable evidence. And when you do RPLs, recognised prior learning, there's systematic validation of that process. So what do I mean by systematic validation? Well, firstly, it is a legal requirement that RPLs are validated. Okay, so at the end of that process, excuse me for a minute, yeah. Your RTO would give you something similar to this type of table. So for every unit within your qualification that you're issuing RPL, you would actually have to state whether all of the documents provided were satisfactory or more evidence was required, that they responded to questions satisfactorily, that there was some level of practical task or you know, or a professional body that could replace that, third-party reports if they were provided. So whatever was negotiated and provided, that you've ticked that it was satisfactory or perhaps not applicable. And then this is something probably very familiar to you. V for validated, A for authentic, C for current. So this is what's meant by systematically validating. So we're applying the rules of evidence when we consider the evidence that's been submitted. Okay, so once again in this table we've actually looked at, let's actually get it in a different view for you. All right, that might be a little bit better. Okay, so you can see we can tick off whether it's valid. So, you know, does it actually assess what it's meant to assess? You know, is it relevant for that product? If not, discard it and ask for more evidence. Is it authentic? Is it the candidate's own work if it's authentic? And current. How current is it? Does it meet current industry standards? So once you can consider the evidence from that aspect and tick it off, you've validated it yourself. Okay, so now we're looking at the critical evidence is required. So you're looking at that unit of competency still and making sure that they've submitted enough evidence holistically to meet the evidence requirements, and that the underpinning knowledge and understanding has been demonstrated through the competency conversation, that the employability skills of that training package have been demonstrated, and your key competencies have been met. So, this is just one example of a validation table that could occur at the end of an RPL. Your RTO will have developed their own. So right the way at the end, when all of these validation considerations have been met satisfactorily, here we go, we've got sufficiency down here. So VAC and then your S for your rules of evidence is there. Finally, when all of that's done, we're in a position to say competent or not yet competent for each of the modules. And at that point, you can issue the statement of attainments or the qualification to meet the recognised prior learning.